Assalamu alaikum dear students, I welcome you all to this important lecture on philosophy and education. Dear students, today we'll be talking about philosophy, we'll be talking about education, and we'll be also talking about one of the schools of the philosophy, that is idealism. In this video lecture, we are also going to talk about the relationship between philosophy and education. Dear students, as you can see in the first slide, the literal meaning of the philosophy, that is, the philosophy has been derived from the two Greek words, phileo and sophia. Philo means love and sophia means wisdom. Philosophy in literal words, we can say that its literal meaning is love of knowledge or love of learning. So as you can see in the next slide, you can see that philosophy actually is love of knowledge. One who loves knowledge is a philosopher. Philosophy is an activity. Philosophy is actually the comprehensive picture of the universe. Philosophy is also the guide to the way of life, and philosophy is a science. So these things remind me of a great philosopher, Plato, who once said that philosopher is the one who he has taste for every sort of knowledge but is never satisfied and is curious to learn, may be termed as a philosopher. So philosopher is the one who always is in search of knowledge, who always has a thirst and quench for knowledge, and he is always looking for the knowledge. And this also reminds me of another philosopher, Aristotle, who once said that every one of us follows out a philosophy, whether we are aware of it or not. So according to Aristotle, every one of us has a philosophy. हम में से हर एक बंदे के पास philosophy है, अपना फ़लसफ़ा है, लेकिन चाहे हमें उस बारे में पता हो या ना पता हो. As you can see in the next slide, we have some definitions about philosophy given by some great educationists and some great philosophers, and one among them, that is Coleridge, he defines philosophy as the science of all sciences. And we have one more definition that was given by Cicero. He says that philosophy is the mother of all arts. So philosophy actually, why we call it mother? Because mother gives birth to a child. And in the same way, the different subjects have, जैसे psychology है, philosophy है, sociology है, and many other subjects that we have. So these different subjects actually जो है इनकी birth जो हुई है, that is out of the philosophy, because philosophy जब उसकी practical shape आ जाती है, then that becomes education. So we have different forms of subjects, but their mother is philosophy. So philosophy basically जहाँ किसी भी subject का origin है, वो philosophy से ही आता है. And in the same way, अगर हम देखें कि John Dewey की एक definition इस पे है, so you can see that whenever philosophy has been taken seriously, it has always been assumed that it is signified, its significance in achieving as a wisdom that would influence the conduct of the life. So philosophy actually influences the conduct of the life as well. So in the next slide, you can see we are talking about education now. So we have got the literal meaning of philosophy. Now we are trying to know about the literal meaning of education. We have just tried to know the basic meaning of philosophy, or the basic concept of philosophy. So here we will be also talking about the basics of education. So education, as we can see that literally it has been derived from the two Latin words educare and educere. Educare means to bring up and to nourish, and in the same way we can see that educere means to draw out and to lead out. And one more derivative term is educatum, which means the act of teaching and training. Now coming to the meaning of the education. Education is acquisition of knowledge. When we acquire knowledge, we say that we have acquired education. And if we compare it with the philosophy, philosophy means search for knowledge. And one difference between the two is that one is related to the search for the knowledge, and the other, that is education, it is related to the acquisition of knowledge. Now we have one more thing about education, that it is a tool to discipline the intellect. यानी कि एक इंसान को जो disciplined बनाता है, that is only education. And education, one more thing is that it is a preparation for life. It prepares an individual for life. It helps an individual to get adjusted in different forms of life. Say for example, to get adjusted in school, to get adjusted in family, to get adjusted in neighborhood, to get adjusted in different forms of one's life. And education is also direction, and education is also growth. Education shows us the direction. It shows us the direction where to go, where not to go. What is the proper direction through which I can achieve my educational objectives. In the same way, education is growth. It helps an individual to grow. That is, it helps an individual to grow to maturity, to take mature decisions, and to believe in oneself, then one thing that is transmission of culture. The culture can be transmitted only with the help of education, because education is the best guarantee for the transmission of culture. In the next slide, you can see that we have philosophy and education and their interdependence. So we, just as stated earlier in the lecture, that we are going to talk about the relationship between philosophy and education. In this slide, we'll be talking about what kind of a relation they have. So one of the famous educationists, Bremel, he has said that it is from the stuff of philosophy that education is created. So from the stuff of education, it is from the stuff of the philosophy rather, it is the education that is created. And one of the philosophers like Ross, he says that philosophy and education are like the two sides of the same coin, because one side, a coin without one side is invalid. So both of them are, I mean to say, they are very much closely related to each other. बहुत ही एक दूसरे के साथ वाबस्ता है. Without one, the other is invalid. So if you have a coin which is having two sides, that is a valid coin. But if you have a coin with only one side, that is not a valid coin, and that will not help you to get anything from the market. So similarly, यहाँ पर भी हम क्या देखते हैं कि philosophy, जैसे कि रॉस का कहना है कि that philosophy and education are like the two sides of the same coin. In a similar way, we can see that education is the strongest instrument for the realization of ideas of life. So education हमें मदद करता है कि जो हमारे आइडियाज़ है, जो हमारा फ़लसफ़ा है, जो हमारी फ़िलोसफी है, उसको हम रियलाइज़ कर सकते हैं only with the help of education. And one more thing that we are going to talk about is that the fact that the plant of education draws its nourishment from the soil of philosophy. जो ये plant of education है, यानी कि एजुकेशन जो है ये अपना जो नरिशमेंट है, जिस तरह एक प्लांट जो है नरिशमेंट लेता है फ्रॉम द सॉइल, सिमिलरली जो एजुकेशन है, फॉर इट द सॉइल इज़ फिलोसफी. एंड जितनी अच्छी फिलोसफी होगी, जितना अच्छा फ़लसफ़ा होगा, जितना अच्छा फिलोसफिकल आइडियाज़ होंगे, द बेटर द फिलोसफिकल आइडियाज़, द बेटर द एजुकेशन. Then philosophy is one thing that it answers all the ultimate questions about education. All the questions related to education, all the doubts related to question, they are answered by the philosophy. In the next slide, you can see that John Dewey, one of the greatest philosophers of modern times, who is actually the founder of pragmatism, he says that philosophy may be defined as the theory of education in most of its general phase. And one more definition that was given by John Dewey, that is philosophy, education is a laboratory where philosophical distinctions become concrete and are tested. जहाँ पर philosophical distinctions या philosophical doubts जो है वो जो है clear होते हैं. जो education है, it just acts like a lab. And in the similar way, we see that the Spencer says that true education is practicable only in true philosophies. That is, we can only practice true education where there is a true philosophy, where there is a philosophy which is based on truth. And in the same way, one more philosopher, that is Fichte, he also tries to explain the interconnectedness and the interlink between philosophy and education by saying that the aim of education will never attain complete clearness without philosophy. That is, कि philosophy जो है अपनी aim कभी भी हासिल नहीं कर सकती, जो education है rather अपनी जो aim है वो कभी हासिल नहीं कर सकता without philosophy. So we must have a philosophy, we must have some kind of ideas without which we cannot achieve our aim. In the next slide, you can see that just in the beginning of the video, this video lecture, I talked about the different schools of philosophy. I talked about that we will be talking about one school of philosophy, that is idealism. So we will be progressing with one more thing, that is we will be talking about idealism. In the next slide, you can see that this word idealism, it signifies two terms. One is the idea and the other is the ideals. So Plato, about whom I talked earlier in this lecture, that is Plato conceived of ideas as the basis of the philosophy. This idealism actually is based on one core thing, and one focus is there, that is it always talks about ideas, it talks about ideals. So as far as Plato is concerned, his philosophy of idealism represents more of an idea that can be better known as idealism. Idealism actually is the oldest theory of the philosophy. So the oldest theory of philosophy and the oldest school of philosophy we have, that is idealism. In the next slide, we can see that the exponents of school of idealism. The main exponent of school of idealism is Plato. We have another philosopher, Kant, Immanuel Kant. We have Hegel. We have Froebel. We have Dayanand Saraswati, who is an Indian philosopher. We have William T. Harris, and we have Rabindranath Tagore, and who is actually one of the naturalists, or who follows the naturalism school of philosophy. If we talk about the concept or the basic postulates of idealism, as talked earlier, that its main focus is on ideas. The main focus of idealism is on ideas. So ideas are the main thing that idealists talk about. And the next thing that idealism talks about, spirituality. It talks about mind, it talks about spirit, it talks about ideas. It believes that this material world is not the real world, but spiritual world is the real world. So it actually kind of discards this material world, because more focus is on spiritual development. And if we talk about the spiritual development, in spiritual development, it lays more focus on personality development. It lays more focus on moral development. It lays more focus on eternal values. It lays more focus on absolute values. As you can see in the next slide, you can see also some other postulates. It is basically, it believes in that universe exists in the spirit. It also believes that mechanical explanation of the universe is inadequate. It believes that man is the central creation. Man is the best species, which we call in Urdu as Ashraf al-Makhluqat, the best creation of God. So this idealism basically believes that man is the incarceration of God. Man is the representative of the God on the earth. And greater emphasis has been laid on, I just stated earlier, that it has been placed on mental and spiritual aspect of the universe. In the next slide, you can see that the idealist concept of education is something which leads one to the highest moral conduct and deep spiritual insight. So idealist education is that education which leads an individual to the spiritual insight. And in the words of Rusk, education must enable mankind through its culture to enter more and more fully into the spiritual realm. So the main focus of idealism is spirituality. The main focus of idealism is ideas. And the ideas, those ideas which are good for the society, which are for the betterment of the society. In the next slide, we can see that the aims of the education of idealism. So idealism and its aims of education, we'll be talking about this thing and in the current slide. So the first aim is exaltation of human personality or self-realization. Idealism believes in self-realization. Self-realization, that one must understand what is the purpose of his life. Why is he in this world? What he has to do? What is his mission? What is his objectives? What are his aims? And so without realizing one's own self, as Allama Iqbal says, खुदी को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तदबीर से पहले खुदा खुद बंदे से कहे बता तेरी रजा क्या है. So we have to develop our internal self. So idealism believes in developing internal self of an individual. Then the second point, that is universal education. Idealists believe that education is the birthright of every person. Idealists believe that education should be given to each and every person without any discrimination on the basis of caste, color, creed, religion, race, etc. किसी भी कलर का हो, किसी भी religion का हो, idealists जो है, they believe that education is a universal thing and it must be given to everyone without any discrimination. So the next point is that enrichment of culture and environment. So one of the most important aim of idealist education is the enrichment of culture. So education should help in the enrichment of culture, education should help in the preservation of culture, education should help in the transmission of a culture. This is one of the aim of as idealist school of philosophy. Then we have cultivation of moral values. So as you know that when we talked about the basic characteristics of idealism and the basic postulates of idealism, it talked about mostly about the values. So just stated earlier that it believes in the values of truth, goodness and beauty. These are the absolute values or the unchanging values, and idealists lay more focus on moral and character development. Then in the next slide we can see that idealism talks about discipline, idealism and discipline. Idealism talks about self-discipline or inner discipline or self-analysis as the main disciplinary factors. So one has to be self-disciplined, one has to be to focus on one thing, that is on self-insight and self-analysis. आपको अपने आप को जानना पड़ेगा, अपने आप को झांकना पड़ेगा, then ये आपके disciplinary factors बनेंगे. Then in the next slide you can see idealism and role of teacher. So we are going to talk about idealism and role of teacher. So in this we'll be discussing what actually the teacher should be like as far as the philosophy of idealism is concerned. So the teacher, as far as idealism is concerned, is a role model. He's a role model for his students and a friend, philosopher and guide of his student. So teacher has to act as a friend, that is he has to have a friendly behavior with the students. Then he has to act as a philosopher, that is he must have a thirst and quench for the knowledge. He must be a knowledgeable person. Then he has to guide. So it is one of the most important duty of the teacher is to guide the students to the perfection. Then the teacher is the perfecter of the mind. That is, the teacher is the person who can perfect the mind of an individual. Then he is a compendium of all virtues. Whatever the virtues that the teacher has, they are to be inculcated into the minds of the students, because teacher जो है उसकी जो qualities है वो students को attract करती है. Then teacher is actually the co-worker of the God. Some people say that he is the spiritual figure next to the God. Idealists believe that he is the co-worker with the God. Then we have that is the apostle of peace and progress. Without teacher there can be no peace of mind, there can be no progress of an individual. Then he is a man of spiritual heritage. Teacher is a spiritual being. Then he is concerned with the personification of the reality. Then if we talk about curriculum as far as idealism is concerned, idealism attaches great importance to those subjects which provide significant knowledge and wisdom. As we know that this idealism is the oldest school of the philosophy, and philosophy is mostly concerned with generation of knowledge. So idealism also focuses on those subjects which provide knowledge to the students. Then we have that these experiences correspond to various activities through which one has to acquire the highest good and inheritance of values. One has to inherit values, and these values can be inherited only when we have such kind of education which is based on spirituality. In the next slide you can see a kind of a graphic about what kind of an educational system should be there. So in the slide you can see that if we talk about education, idealism broadly categorizes education into two main things. One is the physical activity and another is the spiritual activity. In physical activity, the care of body is taken into consideration, and the different skills, development of different skills is taken into consideration. And as far as the spirituality is concerned, the moral, aesthetic and religious and intellectual activities are concerned. So mostly they focus on one thing, that is spiritual education, character development, intellectual development and etc. And in this slide, in the next slide, you can see that idealism and methods of teaching. Idealists use number of methods of teaching. Some of the methods which we will discuss today are question answer method. They believe in questioning and they believe in answering those questions. So if you have any doubt, you can question your teacher, and then this question answering helps us in clarifying different doubts. Then we have a discussion method. Idealists also focus on discussion method. They believe that discussion also helps in clarification of doubts. Then we have a lecture method. So lecture method which is in vogue, which we are using currently and which I am using rather this time, the lecture method which is almost used by every school of philosophy. Then we have imitation. Imitation means that we imitate the teachers, we imitate the character of the teachers, and we imitate those who have a good moral conduct and character. So this was all about the education, philosophy, relationship between philosophy and education, and one of the schools of the philosophy in brief. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.